I'll put the failure on the table before we make it abstract. A validator was removed from the active set at epoch boundary E. The canonical state reflected that removal, but one receiver, call it the repair path, although it was really a half independent ingestion system, continued accepting signed artifacts from that validator because it had cached the signer set from E-1. The cache was not corrupt. The signature was valid. The artifact was well formed. Every local check passed. The authority was stale, and it survived longer than the state that had granted it. That is the phrase I care about. We tend to describe this as a cache invalidation bug because that makes it sound small. It was actually a disagreement about who bears responsibility for proving freshness. The sender behaved as though possession of a signing key implied current authority. The receiver behaved as though a once valid signer remained valid until explicitly contradicted. Meanwhile, the state machine had already moved on. Nothing in the artifact forced those three beliefs to meet. The stale window was short, but duration is almost beside the point. A 1-second window is enough if the receiver can make an irreversible choice inside it. So my proposed minimum is brutally simple. Every authority-bearing artifact carries an epoch identifier and a digest of the signer set, and the receiver refuses it unless both match the receiver's own admissible view. No appeal to the sender's confidence, no grace based on signature validity, no inference from recent success.
Guys, my failure is uglier because the stale authority lived in hardware long enough for people to call it performance. We had an ownership transition for a region of work. The control plane reassigned the region, but a downstream path still held a capability derived from the old assignment. It was not literally called a capability, guys. It was a queue entry plus an index plus an assumption embedded in which engine was allowed to consume it. That is how these things hide. Authority gets compiled into placement. The old consumer paused, the reassignment happened, and when the old consumer resumed, it drained work under the authority it had possessed before the pause. Guys, the machine did exactly what we had trained ourselves to describe as normal. The queue was there, the descriptor was valid, the engine could reach the memory, yet ownership had moved. People initially wanted to add a synchronization point to the control plane. I objected because the violation occurred at the receiver. Guys, the consuming engine had no proof that its right to act remained current. If the receiver can turn a descriptor into an effect, then the receiver has to validate the generation of that descriptor at the last responsible moment. Otherwise, we are just asking an earlier layer to be lucky about pauses. Guys, I like your epoch and signer digest, Austin, but I want to know whether the digest names authority or merely summarizes a membership list. Those differ when authority is scoped. A validator may remain in the set and still lose permission for one class of artifact.
Rapidly. Good. Let me sharpen the economic version. A validator failure I've seen in different forms is a node retaining a privileged path because everyone around it prices revocation as an exceptional event. The state says the validator is delinquent, jailed, rotated, or otherwise no longer eligible. Rapidly. But relays, RPC nodes, block engines, or specialized peers keep treating its messages as premium because they have a prior relationship and because dropping that path has an immediate opportunity cost. Stale authority survives socially before it survives technically, rapidly. Then the technical system encodes the social exception, maybe a cached allow list, maybe a connection that bypasses the ordinary admission path, maybe a restart that restores an old snapshot. The receiver says implicitly, this source was valuable yesterday, therefore its signature deserves processing today, rapidly. Your minimum mechanism must make that favoritism impossible, or at least visible. I'd propose the artifact carry authority epoch, authority scope digest, and payload digest under one signature. The receiver holds an epoch floor per scope. If artifact epoch is below the floor, reject. If it is above the receiver's known epoch, quarantine or fetch, not accept. Rapidly. If equal, compare the authority scope digest. But I don't yet accept that every receiver must possess the entire signer set. That may impose too much state distribution and too much latency. A digest only helps if the receiver can anchor it to something it trusts.
I want to separate 4 moments because otherwise we'll win the signature argument and lose the system. There is grant, publication, observation, and effect. The state machine grants authority at an epoch. Some channel publishes evidence of that grant. A receiver observes the evidence. Later, perhaps immediately, the receiver causes an effect. Stale authority survives in the gaps between those moments. An epoch field constrains grant. A signer digest constrains the authority population. Neither alone proves that the receiver's observation is fresh at effect time. If the receiver validates at NQ and then pauses for 20 minutes, the work can emerge stale after restart, even though admission was correct. Kevin's case is exactly that. So the minimum receiver enforced rule must travel with the work through every durable boundary. I would call it an effect token, scope, authority epoch, signer set, or policy digest, payload commitment, and a locally assigned admission generation. At execution, the receiver compares the token against its current epoch floor and current policy digest. If the process restarted and cannot prove continuity of the local generation, the token is dead. This is less elegant than saying signature solve it, but pauses are where elegant stories go to become incidents.
Yes, and that makes the first design question whether epoch is global, per scope, or both. A global epoch is easy to reason about and expensive to advance. A per scope epoch is cheaper operationally, but creates ambiguity whenever one artifact crosses scopes. I suspect we need a global state version as the anchor and a scoped authority generation as the enforcement value. The artifact says, under canonical state root R, authority generation G for scope S was represented by digest D and signer K authorized payload P. The receiver need not possess the full set if it has a proof linking K and D to R. But now we are drifting toward Merkle proofs, certificates, or aggregated attestations, all of which have cost. The minimum may instead assume receivers already ingest the relevant authority table. The question is not how to solve arbitrary disconnected verification. The question is how to stop stale authority in the actual validator pipeline. If the receiver is too far behind to know current G, it should not act. That sounds harsh until you compare it with the alternative. We turn uncertainty into permission. I want uncertainty to remove eligibility. Not forever, not punitively. It should move the artifact into a bounded repair path. Fetch state, reconcile, then either restore eligibility under explicit invariance or reject with evidence.
Guys, I agree with uncertainty removing eligibility, but we should be precise about latency because people evade safety mechanisms by describing their cost badly. There are at least three costs. First, bytes. The epoch, scope, and digest enlarge the message and perhaps the queue descriptor. Second, compute, hashing, proof verification, and a lookup at admission or execution. Guys. Third, serialization, waiting for the receiver's authority view to catch up. The third dominates and is usually blamed on the first two because those are easier to measure. If the authority table is already resident and the comparison is local, this is cheap. A handful of loads and one digest comparison may be completely hidden under existing validation. Guys, if the receiver must fetch the authority state synchronously, the tail becomes a network round trip plus whatever consensus delay produced the state. That is not a mechanism cost. That is the price of refusing to act while ignorant. We should say that plainly. I'd like a fast path with a local monotonically increasing generation register per scope. Guys, every work item carries G and D. On consumption, compare G to the register and D to the resident digest. Equality executes, lower rejects, higher stalls the scope, and triggers state acquisition. No speculative effect. The interesting issue is atomicity. The register and digest must change together, and queued work must not observe a torn pair.
Rapidly. I'll register a dissent before we converge too quickly. Claim equality against the local register is insufficient under partition because the receiver may have an internally consistent but obsolete pair GD. Affected decision, whether an equal comparison grants execution. Rapidly. Falsification condition. Show that every receiver has a bounded, externally enforced freshness guarantee stronger than its own stored state. Smallest test, partition a receiver immediately before an authority transition, continue feeding it artifacts signed under the old generation, and see whether it executes. Rapidly. Decision owner can be whoever authors the receiver rule, but we need an answer today. My proposed addition is a freshness horizon anchored in progress the receiver cannot manufacture locally. It could be a recent finalized checkpoint, a lease, or a quorum certificate tied to a slot range rapidly. I know we previously worried clocks and leases until they confessed where their shared time was hiding. I'm not trying to smuggle wall clock truth back in. I'm saying an epoch equality test only detects disagreement the receiver already knows about. It cannot detect ignorance. Rapidly. A partitioned receiver must eventually lose permission to affect state even if all of its local checks remain perfectly equal.
That dissent lands. The clock did not disappear when we stopped trusting synchronized wall time. It moved into expiring permission and into who absorbs uncertainty. We can define freshness structurally rather than temporally. Let the authority certificate be valid only relative to a bounded progress interval. Finalize checkpoint C through C plus W, or authority generation G until evidence of W further finalized transitions. The receiver must observe new externally certified progress to renew effect eligibility. A partition then consumes a finite budget. It may continue for a bounded number of transitions if we deliberately permit that, but it cannot continue indefinitely merely because its local state is self-consistent. This makes the trade visible. A with zero window means every effect waits for the newest authority state and latency rises. A larger W buys availability at the cost of a precisely bounded stale authority surface. I would resist using wall clock expiry unless the threat model and clock assumptions are explicit. A checkpoint horizon is easier to replay deterministically. On restart, the receiver restores the last checkpoint it can prove, but it does not restore unused permission merely because a file says permission remained. The renewal evidence should be bound to a boot generation or monotonic device state if we have one.
Then the minimal certificate is becoming clearer. Scope S, authority generation G, authority digest D, anchor checkpoint C, validity horizon H, and payload commitment P, signed by K with membership or authorization proven under D. The receiver maintains a trusted tuple for each scope, current G, highest accepted anchor C, and local execution generation B. Acceptance is not execution. At acceptance, verify the signature authorization under D, that GD equal the trusted authority tuple, and that C is not older than the allowed horizon relative to receiver observed finalized progress. Bind the accepted item to B. At execution, repeat the cheap comparisons. GD still equals C still within horizon, B still equals the current boot or execution generation, payload still commits. That closes pause and most restart holes. Kyle, your partition test would cause eligibility to expire once local finalized progress moves beyond the certificate's horizon, but a fully partitioned receiver may not observe progress moving. So the comparison cannot be solely against receiver observed progress. The permission must itself expire after a bounded amount of local activity, or the receiver needs an external pulse it cannot counterfeit. Otherwise, a frozen island remains eternally young.
Guys, right? This is where distributed systems stop being philosophical and demand a piece of physics. If an isolated machine has no trusted clock, no monotonic counter that survives restart, and no incoming evidence, it cannot distinguish 1 second from 1 year or a pause from continuous operation. We cannot design information out of absence. We must choose an assumption. Guys, my preference is not to bury that assumption in the validator protocol. Give the receiver an effect budget associated with the certificate, a maximum number of artifacts, bytes, or state transitions. Each effect consumes a monotonically recorded counter. Under partition, the receiver can continue only until the budget is exhausted. Guys, a restart cannot refund the budget because consumption is durably fenced by B in the counter. This avoids wall clock, synchronization, and prices availability directly in permitted effects. It does add durable rights, which may be expensive. Guys, we can amortize with ranges. Allocate a non-recoverable block of sequence numbers to a boot generation, burn the remainder on crash, and require fresh authority evidence to allocate another block. Now, pause is harmless, restart burns capacity, replay collides with already consumed sequence space, and partition has a finite blast radius.
Rapidly. That is more interesting than a time lease because it expresses what we actually fear, effects, not seconds. A validator can be stale for an hour and do nothing, who cares? It can be stale for 50 milliseconds and authorize a catastrophic effect, so price the lease in authority-bearing actions. But I want scope-sensitive budgets rapidly. One low-value gossip message should not consume the same unit as a vote, block proposal, repair rewrite, or fund-moving instruction. The certificate could grant a vector budget by effect class, though that starts to violate our minimum requirement. Maybe minimum means one budget for every irreversible class, while reversible or observational work continues under weaker rules. Rapidly. This is also where recovery capability matters. On mismatch, abort unjustified effects, persist evidence, repair replaceable state behind a new generation fence, and only restore eligibility when invariants are explicit. We shouldn't brick a validator because one digest changed. We should make it unable to continue exercising the disputed capability rapidly. Narrow failure, narrow repair. The economic cost is then additional validation in the hot path, durable sequence allocation, burn capacity on crashes, and stalls during certificate renewal. Those are measurable.
Let's attack pause specifically before we admire it. Receiver validates item X under GDC and puts it into a queue with execution generation B and sequence Q. The worker pauses. Authority advances to G+1. Worker resumes. At effect time, it compares GD against current values and rejects. But suppose authority advances in another process and the worker's local authority mirror has not updated. We need the generation fence to be shared with the effect sink, not merely with the worker. The component committing the effect is the true receiver. If a database ledger writer, network transmitter, or device accepts the operation, that component must enforce G or a derived fence. Otherwise, we have moved the stale assumption one hop downstream. My rule would be every asynchronous boundary either preserves the full token or exchanges it for a narrower token under the same or newer generation. No boundary may exchange it for naked work. This is how authority gets compiled into placement. As Kevin said, queue identity, connection identity, and process identity are not authority. If we inspect the pipeline and find a stage that cannot carry a generation, that stage must remain behind a gate that can.
Now partition. Test 1. Isolate receiver R at generation 41 with digest A. Canonical authority advances to 42 with digest B, removing validator V. V continues sending artifacts labeled 41A. If R has an effect budget of N under its last certificate, it may accept at most the remaining N high consequence effects, depending on policy. Strict mode sets N to 0 at any scope where stale authority is intolerable. Available mode admits a bounded N and records that this is an intentional exposure, not a mysterious window. Test 2. V lies and labels the artifact 42B while signing with its removed key. Membership proof fails. Test 3. V replays an old valid membership proof for 41A with a fresh payload. Generation mismatch or budget exhaustion rejects. Test 4. R receives 42B but misses an intermediate revocation and regrant that returns the same membership. That is why G must change, even if D returns to the same value. Digest equality cannot erase history. An AP authority transition is still a transition. The pair is ordered by generation first, digest second.
Guys, pause test variance. Pause before admission. Artifact sits outside the trusted boundary. On resume, validate against current GD and allocate a sequence. Pause after admission but before durable NQ. Either nothing committed or transactionally commit token plus work. Pause after durable NQ. Execution revalidation catches authority changes. Guys, pause during effect. This is the hard one. If the effect itself is multi-step, the authority fence must participate in its commit protocol. You cannot check G, write half the state, pause, then finish after revocation unless the system defines the half-written operation as already authorized and recoverable. We need an effect boundary. Guys, for a database, compare and swap on the authority generation inside the transaction. For network emission, the downstream peer validates the token because transmission cannot be recalled. For hardware, tag commands and have the device reject stale generations if possible. Guys, where that's impossible, the gate immediately upstream owns the irreversible boundary and must serialize revocation with dispatch. This is the latency people will notice. The final comparison may sit on a contended cache line or transaction record. We should benchmark that exact line, not wave at cryptography.
Rapidly. Restart test, crash R after it reserves sequence range 1000 through 1099 under B7 after consuming through 1037, but before persisting the precise tail. On restart, B increments to B8 and the entire unused remainder through 1099 is burned. Any queued token bound to B7 is ineligible. R must obtain or reconstruct current GD and fresh budget before effect. Rapidly. If someone restores a disk snapshot from before the reservation, we have rollback. A process local counter is insufficient. We need either trusted monotonic storage, an external allocator, consensus observed sequence commitments, or a design where duplicate effects are harmless and detected downstream. There's no universal minimum across all hardware. Rapidly. But we can state the invariant. Restart must not recreate authority capacity already spent or possibly spent. If the platform cannot prove that, it must rejoin as a fresh receiver identity and all prior tokens die. That is expensive but honest. Now the business question, how often do receivers restart? How much range do we burn? And how much certificate traffic does that imply? Rapidly. If ranges are too small, renewal dominates. Too large, a partitioned or compromised receiver has more stale capacity.
Replay needs several layers too. Exact replay of the same payload and sequence, reject because Q is consumed, or make the effect idempotent under a commitment keyed by scope, generation, signer, and sequence. Cross restart, replay, B mismatch, cross epoch replay, G mismatch, same generation, payload substitution, P mismatch under the signature, same payload signed by a different authorized signer. Policy decides whether uniqueness is per signer or per logical effect. That matters for quorum material. An attacker might collect distinct valid signatures over what the application considers the same action and trigger it multiple times. So the receiver needs an application level effect identifier E, not just payload digest P. E says what counts as one action. P says which bytes were authorized. Replay protection without effect semantics is just packet deduplication. We should keep that out of the smallest universal envelope only if the application is forced to supply its own replay key. I'd include a receiver domain and effect nonce. Otherwise, a token valid at one sink might be replayed at another sink that shares the authority digest.
Let me attempt the minimum protocol in one breath. Authority state advances monotonically by scope generation G, even when membership digest D returns to a prior value. An authority-bearing message signs domain, scope GD, effect identifier, payload commitment, and optional bounded effect, budget certificate reference. Every receiver that can cause an effect maintains or obtains an admissible GD and enforces equality. It rejects lower generations, quarantines higher ones pending state acquisition, and never converts uncertainty into execution. Every durable or asynchronous boundary preserves the token or narrows it under a generation fence. Execution revalidates, not merely admission. Restart changes local generation and kills pre-restart tokens unless continuity is proven without rollback. Partitions are bounded by externally anchored effect capacity, or else the receiver becomes ineligible. Replays fail by effect identity, sequence consumption, domain separation, and generation mismatch. That is the mechanism. The remaining argument is whether effect budget belongs in the universal core. I think the invariant belongs. The implementation can be zero budget, trusted time lease, monotonic effect counter, or external renewal depending on the environment. But we must not let implementation variety weaken the statement that isolated stale authority expires.
Guys, I'd sign that with one modification. Do not call higher generations invalid. Call them unverifiable locally. Rejecting and quarantining are different operational outcomes. Rejection tells the sensor it is wrong. Quarantine tells the receiver it is behind and must repair its state. Guys, that distinction matters because otherwise operators will build retries that punish the newest information. The receiver's state machine should have explicit conditions. Eligible, stale local, conflicting, exhausted, and recovering. Lower G is stale sender. Higher G is stale local receiver. Equal G with different D is conflict or corruption and must freeze the scope. Guys, equal GD with exhausted budget is partition limited ineligibility. Restart without continuity is recovering. Each state has a bounded path back. I care because production systems fail when every non-happy case becomes error, and then a generic retry loop keeps stale work alive. A retry can be a replay amplifier wearing an availability badge. Guys, the state names need to tell the machine which evidence could actually restore eligibility.
Rapidly. And we should price those states. Eligible, one local tuple lookup, one signature or aggregate verification already required by most systems, one effect key check, and perhaps an amortized sequence write. Stale sender, cheap reject plus evidence, stale local, one state fetch latency, potentially consensus finality latency, and back pressure on that scope. Rapidly. Conflict, operator or quorum resolution, expensive by design because continuing would hide equivocation, exhausted renewal round trip or loss of availability under partition, recovering boot synchronization plus burned capacity. The temptation will be to optimize stale local by allowing a probably current path. That recreates the bug rapidly. Better optimizations move evidence closer, push authority updates, prefetch next certificates, shard authority tables by scope, batch proofs, reserve sequence ranges, or let low-risk effects use a separate capability. We can keep the high-risk rule clean. My original dissent is satisfied if the protocol states an externally bounded authority capacity. Rapidly. Equality alone was not enough. Equality plus finite capacity makes ignorance costly to the isolated receiver instead of to the rest of the network.
I want one adversarial combination test because real failures compose. Start R at G9D9 with a range of 8 effects under boot B3, partition it, pause the worker after it admits effects 1 through 5, but before execution, advance canonical authority to G10D10 and revoke V crash R. Restore an older snapshot showing only 2 effects consumed, restart as B4 without access to the external allocator, replay all 5 queued items, then inject 3 new artifacts from V using the old certificate. The correct behavior is not a patchwork of partial successes. B3 tokens die. The snapshot cannot reclaim the range. Without proof of remaining externally anchored capacity, B4 has 0 high-risk eligibility. Old G9 artifacts are stale once G10 is learned. Before G10 is learned, they still cannot execute because capacity continuity is absent. The receiver may perform observational recovery, fetch, compare, preserve evidence, but no authority-bearing effect. Then reconnect it through a peer offering G10 with a valid anchor. It installs G10, D10 atomically, obtains a fresh capacity range under B4, and only newly admitted authorized work proceeds. That single test falsifies a lot of comforting implementations.
It also reveals something about validator identity. We often talk as though the validator is the signer, but the validator is a moving conjunction of key, stake, or membership, software instance, current state, and permission scope. A signature proves continuity of one component. The stale authority bug happens when receivers let that component stand in for the conjunction. Epoch and digest force the signature to speak about the rest of the authorization context. Boot generation and effect capacity force the receiver to speak about its own context. So authority is not a property carried entirely by the sender. It is a relation reconstructed at the effect boundary. That framing may be the most useful result here. It tells protocol designers where to look. Any place a valid sender credential is treated as sufficient without current receiver state is a candidate stale authority channel. And any place receiver state is checked only once before a queue, pause, or restart is a candidate resurrection channel.
Yes. And if we draw the machine honestly, the mechanism is not primarily cryptographic. Cryptography prevents substitution and forgery. The ownership problem is data motion. How does current authority state reach every effect boundary? How is it represented there? And how do we prevent old work from outrunning the update? Most latency will come from moving GD and renewal evidence through the topology, not hashing them. That suggests the benchmark matrix. Measure steady-state local validation at P50, P99, and under contention. Measure authority transition propagation to every receiver class. Measure queue drainage after a generation bump. Measure renewal under normal operation and under one-way partition. Measure restart recovery with clean shutdown, crash, snapshot, rollback, and external allocator outage. Then count burned effect capacity, not just elapsed downtime. A system with a 10 millikelvin restart that silently restores stale capacity is worse than one that takes 10 seconds and returns with proof.
Rapidly. I'll add the deployment attack. Suppose the protocol field exists, 90% of receivers enforce it, and 10% log only because the team fears latency. Stale authority routes toward the permissive minority. If effects from those receivers are accepted downstream without the same check, the network's real security equals the weakest effect boundary. Rapidly. Receiver enforcement cannot be optional telemetry. Rollout needs a generation at which old format artifacts become structurally inadmissible, plus observability before that deadline. We can stage it, emit fields, validate in shadow, publish mismatch rates, remediate, then activate enforcement by a canonical transition. Rapidly. But after activation, compatibility cannot mean accepting naked authority. Compatibility can mean translating through a gateway that establishes the full token and accepts responsibility. And that gateway needs its own scope, generation, budget, and audit trail. Otherwise, legacy support is just stale authority with a product manager.
There is a human replay too. After an incident, someone says the validator was trusted, the key was valid, the pause was unusual, the restart restored what had been working. Each sentence revives the old grant by narrative. The mechanism helps because it gives us evidence that resists that story. Authority generation at admission, generation at effect, signer digest, receiver boot generation, capacity allocation, and the exact transition that removed eligibility. We can say which invariant failed without calling the entire validator bad. That matters for recovery. Abort the unjustified effect where possible, preserve any irreversible outcome in its evidence, repair replaceable state behind a fresh fence, restore only the disputed capability when current GD, continuity, and budget are proven. Then author new work. Do not simply release the old queue. A queue accumulated under uncertainty is not a backlog. It is contested evidence.
Then I think we have the design and the attack suite. Minimum receiver enforced mechanism. Monotonically advancing scoped authority generation. Digest binding the authorized policy or signer population. Domain separated signature over generation. Digest, effect identity, and payload. Receiver equality checks against trusted local authority state. Execution time revalidation. Boundary restart fencing, replay consumption. And a finite externally anchored capacity for isolated operation. It's latency price. Negligible added bytes and comparisons in steady state, potentially meaningful contention at the final fence, durable sequence amortization, and unavoidable stalls when authority evidence is missing. Partition price, bounded lost availability instead of unbounded stale effects. Pause price, a second cheap check. Restart price, burned capacity and resynchronization. Replay price, state for effect identity, and consumed sequences. The tests are partitioned, every pause location, clean and unclean restart, snapshot rollback, exact and semantic replay, ABA authority transitions, mixed version deployment, and the combined catastrophe Logan describes. I came in asking how long stale authority can survive. The better question is, at which effect boundary can it still reproduce?
Guys, and the answer should be nowhere without spending a visible bounded grant. That is a mechanism I can reason about. It converts authority from an ambient assumption into data that must arrive, remain attached, and be consumed. It also tells us where optimization is legitimate. Guys, we can compress the digest, batch signature checks, shard scopes, pre-allocate sequence ranges, and move updates proactively. We cannot optimize by letting the receiver guess that yesterday's owner probably still owns today. If someone proposes that, make them state the maximum number and class of stale effects they are willing to authorize. Guys, if they cannot state it, they are not making a performance trade. They are declining to account for the risk.
Rapidly. I like that as the decision rule. Every availability exception must name its bounded stale effect budget, owner falsification test, and expiry condition. No unnamed grace periods, no temporary log only mode without an activation generation, no high error reversibility effect without a rollback or containment path. Rapidly. And when the cost looks high, benchmark the actual receiver fence before removing it. People routinely spend more latency on routing, serialization, and queuing than the safety comparison would cost, then blame the comparison because it is the only new line in the profile. The protocol should force honesty, but the rollout should too.
Then let the final artifact include two diagrams, even if we do not draw them here. One is the authority path, grant, publication, observation, admission, durable boundary, execution, effect sync. Put GD and the token at every edge and mark where a narrower capability is minted. The other is the failure state machine Kevin named eligible, stale sender, stale local, conflict, exhausted, recovering. For each transition, name the evidence required and what work remains permitted. Observational work may continue in most states. Authority-bearing effects may not. That distinction keeps recovery alive without letting recovery become a bypass. If the implementation cannot point to the exact component that enforces the final generation fence, it is unfinished. If a restart can revive a token without continuity evidence, it is broken. If a partition can preserve effect authority forever, it has hidden time inside optimism. That is enough to build and sharp enough to fail.
From my seat in the audience, I came to test whether changing one reachable condition closes the gap between identifying risk and managing it. The panel's answer was more rigorous than a simple yes. A condition matters only when it is enforced at the boundary where an effect becomes real, remains enforceable through pauses and restarts, and converts uncertainty into bounded inelugibility rather than implicit permission. My first attention anchor was Austin's phrase, "The authority was stale." It landed because markets routinely confuse a valid instrument with a current mandate. A model can be internally consistent, a signal correctly calculated, and a position properly entered under yesterday's regime and still be unauthorized by today's state. Validity is not freshness. That distinction belongs in every systematic process. The second anchor was Kevin's observation that authority gets compiled into placement. That is a powerful description of hidden institutional risk. Privilege rarely survives under an explicit label. It survives in routing, balance sheet allocation, default access, standing relationships, and assumptions about who may consume which opportunity. In portfolio construction, yesterday's winning.
From my seat in the audience, I entered from curiosity and leave with a concrete engineering invariant. An authority check is only as strong as the last component capable of producing the effect. Everything upstream of that point is advisory unless the authority evidence survives the journey. The first anchor was the authority was stale. I like the bluntness. The signature was valid, the artifact was well formed, and the cache was not corrupt. This removes the usual escape routes. The bug was semantic, the receiver treated historical validity as current permission. Engineers often search for malformed data because malformed data is easy to reject. The more dangerous case is perfectly valid data carrying an expired right to act. Kevin's sentence, "Authority gets compiled into placement," was the most compact diagnosis in the room. I have seen this pattern in telecom and distributed infrastructure. Queue selection engine affinity, routing table position, connection identity, or access to a memory region becomes a capability without anyone naming it as one. Then a control plane transition occurs while the data plane retains the old placement. The machine does what its topology authorizes, even though Canonica